Okay, good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar, Understanding the 2026-27 Apprenticeship Funding Rules with David Lockhart-Hawkins. I'm Kate and I'll be keeping things running in the background. While we wait for everyone to finish logging in, I'll just run through a few housekeeping points. Thanks, David. So we will be recording the session and everyone who's registered will receive a copy by email within the next week. You are muted throughout the webinar, so if you do need assistance, please use the chat in the top right-hand panel. And there will be a Q&A section at the end of the webinar, so please send in your questions using the question function, which you'll also see in that right-hand panel. With so many of you registered for today's session, we might not be able to respond to all of the questions during the webinar, but we'll get through as many as possible. Next slide, please, David. Great. So we're delighted to be joined today by our guest speaker, compliance specialist David Lockhart-Hawkins. David works with leading sector stakeholders supporting provider growth through effective evidence systems, compliance monitoring, quality improvement and strategic development across post-16 education programmes. He presents national CPD programmes through the SDN Mesmer Group, and he also sits on the APTIM Compliance Advisory Board, working alongside other industry experts and the APTIM product team to ensure that the platform consistently meets evolving compliance standards. David will be taking us through the 2026-27 apprenticeship funding rules with a focus on what's changed, what's stayed the same, and the impact for providers. And we're also very pleased to be joined by APTIM's Martin Woods, who's going to be giving an overview of the impact of these changes for the APTIM platform, and he'll also be available to take questions too. With that, I'll hand over to you, David.
Thank you very much, Kate. Thank you, Martin. Thank you, APTIM, for having me on today. Very warm welcome to all of you joining us on the call today. Every year I do something on the funding rules. It takes a fair bit of work to put together, and we end up with a bit of a snapshot of the core changes and then a little bit more of a deep dive. And today we're going to do a bit of that snapshot of where we are and what's going on. It takes a bit of an approach where you'll know what the previous year's rules are. We're going to talk really about some of the key things that might be in the offing, because it is a draft set of funding rules that we have. They are not the definitive actual rules that are going to be in place. We're expecting a little later on in May the first full version, which should confirm most of what's in that draft rules document. But there was a period of consultation, there was a period of change possibility, and so we might see a few changes in the document come up. So if you're listening to this webinar, watching this webinar anytime after the 11th of May, things may have changed, so we're kind of relevant as of today. I always like to think we're relevant though, Martin, so is that. So yeah, our sources you can see on screen. You will be able to see the final version of funding rules in these links. We have the draft funding rules, we have a summary of changes. We already know what the ILR specification looks like, and there are always some useful updates on the apprenticeship service link in the bottom right hand side of the screen there. That's enough of that. Let's move on. So what we need to think about at today's short session, which we're going to throw an awful lot in, is we want to be aware of some understanding the core headlines of what could be changes, what could be changing, the possible impact and the implication of those things. We want to start thinking about planning actions for the things we can control and the things we know that are coming, and APTIM have already started that journey as far as preparing for the changes in the ILR specification and the things we know that are coming. But I'm stepping on Martin's toes there, and he'll be able to fill you in on that detail a little later. But what I want you to focus on today, is start thinking about some of the change management strategy that you might need to put into play, and initiate once we get that kind of final go ahead in the first version of the funding rules. So understand, consider the risks, communicate that to your organization, set those priorities, and start to think about how we're doing. So what is changing in the journey? Well, this is a diagram that I developed a few years back for the SDN Mesmer Group, who I'm really excited to be working with along on this, the later, longer version of this series. This is the stages of the apprentice journey in 4 key phases: pre-entry, entry, delivery, and progression. Apologies for the many colors on this screen. Normally it's kind of just like a blue and orange, but I've added in green where there are some core changes occurring in the system this year, or where we believe that those changes will be occurring. The orange boxes are when funding starts and funding stops. So you can quite clearly see that there's a fair amount of change in the areas of things we have to do before we start getting funding. It's important to think about those stages and those steps. There are some significant changes in that pre-entry and entry phase. And most of the changes this year are kind of concentrated in the kind of the systemic design and setup of apprenticeship programs. We have new employer incentives, we have adjustments to co-investment, we have the launch of apprenticeship units that took place last month, and all these things have significant impact beyond the funding rules. They actually have operational impact and govern what you can sell and how to sell it without increasing the risk of failure on your part. There are changes to the rules on subcontracting, but if you're reliant on freelance staff, then there may be some significant changes you need to make to your infrastructure to bring you into a compliance position. But again, all these things are to be confirmed in the full version of the rules. But it's highly possible that there's going to be a lot more administrative demand on you to get those things together. Employer engagement, I think, is where there's going to be a lot of work needed behind the scenes, and many of you have already started planning that journey, particularly around the employer incentives. The design of your offer, the clarity and setting the expectation for those incentives is going to be really important, or you're going to spend an awful lot of time dealing with employers asking, where's my money? So you're going to need to spend a lot of time getting the messaging around the new recruitment grant, as it's called, and the changes that have been made in the co-investment area to make sure your messages are clear, because you don't want to be surprising your employers with those things. But at the same time, our hands are still somewhat tied because we're lacking a little bit of detail on that recruitment grant, and that's something certainly to be focusing on when the rule changes are confirmed later this month. Anyway, it's a really useful diagram. If you're finding that your process flow doesn't match this, then do get in touch with me, and I'm more than happy to have a chat about what that could look like. But let's look at some general changes and things to be aware of. So we're still working on version 3 of the 25-26 funding rules. Those will be in play until the end of July of this year. The funding rules, when they do come out, will apply to new starts from the 1st of August. So anyone you're starting now is to the current set of rules. We have the growth and skills levy that's now been introduced. We have a separate funding rules document for apprenticeship units, if that's what you're going to be delivering. And everything now is in this changeover of being rebranded to Department for Work and Pensions that took over from Department for Education in April. So we did have a draft version of the 26-27 apprenticeship funding rules. That's what we currently have, but who knows, probably while we're talking, a new one might come out, or as it did last year, right in the middle of the Aspire conference later on this week. Obviously the deadline for feedback has gone, but be aware of what that new version looks like when it comes out. If you're going to be delivering apprenticeship units, ensure you're working from those specific funding rules. There's quite a lot in there you'll need to be aware of if you are planning that offer. In the meantime, we do know that it is the Department for Work and Pensions that governs our funding now, so you can be changing your contract for services templates with employers to outline that change. Whether you need to or not will depend upon the design of that contract. Okay, let's get into some of the cooler, more detailed changes of things to do. So minor change coming in the area of initial assessment and recognition of prior learning. For a 19+ learner or any 16 to 18-year-old that had some experience, we did in 25-26 have rules requiring skills scans to be conducted against the knowledge, skills, and behaviours of a standard. In 26-27, there's a kind of softening here that could be against the training plan's composition if that training plan aligns to the standards KSBs, i.e. is mapped, i.e. all the KSBs are in this training plan, therefore our translation of your prior learning is based on these components in our training plan. That's still going to require probably granular adjustments to hours on the individual components in that plan, but it is going to make that translation a little easier. You're still going to need to conduct initial assessment. You're still going to need to want to understand the entry point of those learners from a qualitative position, but nothing's changing in that realm of calculation of hours. Key change from that came into play for the 25-26 funding rules was the introduction of minimum hours for standards. We still have those, and we're still going to be working out our funding adjustments based on the hours that we were planning to do in our curriculum minus the hours of prior learning. It's just how we're going to reach that might be softened a little bit by being able to use the training plan composition. But let's wait a little more clarity on version 1 when that comes through. Learner eligibility for 25-26, the 50% of their time being spent in England, including remote and hybrid working. For that 50% to be counted, the hours must have been regular planned and known at the start of the apprenticeship. That rule is being softened a little bit to take out the known in advance. Again, just some confirmation that we expect learners to be at least 50% in England will be required. We also had rules that didn't make totally clear whether boot camps or units can take place alongside apprenticeships, but absolutely confirmed they cannot. And then updates were introduced into the rules around the new administration assistant apprenticeship. The first apprenticeship that we've got that has an age limitation directly. So to do the level 2 administration assistant apprenticeship standard, it's only going to be eligible for funding for individuals aged between 16 and 24, or if they were 15 and their birthdays between the last Friday of June and the 31st of August. We have age restrictions on the level 7s still, but this is the first apprenticeship to come out to say, well, literally, this is only for the younger individual. Again, bear that in mind if that's an offer that you're going to be offering. An offer that you're offering. It's terrible English, David. So do think about what that looks like. I think admin assistant and the employer incentives are going to kind of go hand in hand in some provider strategy. So make sure your marketing materials are clear on what it looks like, what the program looks like, and make sure that curriculum you're happy with, because there is a real risk of the hours for that program not being well planned and not being well evidenced. So do think about what those look like as well. We are racing through this. Learning support. No real changes in the area of learning support apart from in the rules regarding support review. 25-26, a learner receiving learning support funding required a review of their learning support arrangements to confirm their continuing necessity and effectiveness. That was 3 monthly in 25-26. It is still 3 monthly for 26-27 unless the expectation is where the learning support need is stable due to a permanent disability and unlikely to change. That still needs to be 3 monthly, but can be light touch according to the rules, which brings an interesting definition of what's the definition of light touch and not light touch in the world of review. My advice to any providers: think quality first in this space. If the plan is not going to change, then yes, that's going to be a very light touch review, but you're still going to need a review template to evidence that. Consider the design of support review. It should be nearly entirely qualitative around necessity and effectiveness. Don't forget necessity, but maintain quality principles there. Again, no other major changes expected here, although the policy document that goes with the funding rules in the learning support space has recently been updated to include some mention of the apprenticeship units learning support rules. So yeah, do have a look at that if you are delivering apprenticeship units. English and maths training. Now, this is something that the department has tried to help make easier for the individual learner. As we know, the functional skills rules changed last year to mean that if the individual was age 19 or over and the employer didn't want that apprentice to do functional skills, they wouldn't need to do the functional skills. But this left some individuals, some learners that wanted to do the functional skills, but their employers didn't want them to do the functional skills, in a kind of butting of heads juxtaposition of challenge and problem. So the department decided they would make it possible for the apprentice to be able to do a functional skill outside of the apprenticeship. Again, this will only apply to new starts from the 1st of August, unless said otherwise. But it would only be funded if that provider had adult skills fund provision of which not every apprenticeship provider does. That might mean that that apprentice might, if they wanted to do the functional skill, might not be able to do it with that provider and might have to go elsewhere to do that functional skill. My advice is that's a very difficult scheduling arrangement and could cause you risk with the actual content for your apprenticeship. So think very carefully how you work with employers and learners to achieve that. We have rules with English and maths for active learning introduced last year, which are that once we've started evidence of English and maths, we should have continuing evidence of English and maths if we're funding those aims. That rule continues, but they've introduced clarification that if you're withdrawing a learner from a maths or English aim, you're using the last day of learning in that maths or English aim. I'd expect that one to probably apply retrospectively, but in the draft it wasn't written clearly that that was the case, so that's something to potentially query. One of the things that's always been unclear with maths and English delivery is how it is to be delivered. What is this, the curriculum scheme of work? What's the hours of that program looking like? Now, 25-26, there was no specified delivery method for that delivery. 26-27, they're adding clarification, and it cannot be self-directed distance learning alone. There needs to be some curriculum in there. And most providers have found out that they need that anyway to have some structure to those qualifications and increase their likelihood of achievement. My advice in the broad area of the functional skill, if you did have an individual apprentice that wants to do a functional skill outside of the apprenticeship, is you've all got to think very long and hard about the work-life study balance. In apprenticeships, you only get all of your money if the apprentice stays until the end of the program. If there's anything that creates a greater risk of that learner withdrawing, it's going to be a significantly excessive workload or study load. And the timing and positioning of that maths English activity could be a risk to your program. Best practice, of course, try and get it into the apprenticeship, try and get it front loaded, and try and develop those English and maths skills early in a program. But yeah, be aware of this one, because it might be something you're trying to do something that benefits the learner, but actually ends up costing yourselves, the learner and the employer, if it's not done right. Don't expect you'll be able to get hold of adult skills funding if you don't already have it. It is, sometimes these things are procured, but it's difficult to get hold of. It might mean you end up using subcontractors to deliver that functional skill, or you acting as a subcontractor for somebody to deliver that functional skill. It's all going to get very messy. So I think the intention is good here, but operationally this one will be quite messy. More on that after May, I would say. Something that the department is a little concerned with is with the defunding of management programs at some level 7 provision, well, most level 7 provision. It hasn't really been clear in funding rules whether a provider could offer higher level qualifications outside of that apprenticeship within an apprenticeship program, i.e. delivery of higher level program within a lower level standard. It wasn't explicitly ineligible, but in the draft rules, a couple of places, paragraph 67.3, that delivery of non-mandatory qualifications at higher levels within apprenticeships would not be allowed, with an evidence requirement that the provider is not delivering non-mandatory qualifications higher level than the level of the standard. Now, these things could take place outside of the apprenticeship, but you've got to be very clear how the content of the program is of the level that you're requiring. Again, I can see some real queries being raised here. My advice is to think about your current and planned models, how you deliver your programs. You've got top-up qualifications in there. You're going to want to clarify with the department how you can put those into play in a way that's going to be transparent and supportable. I think where you've got concurrent delivery of higher level learning within that apprenticeship program, there's going to be risks there, because what is the off-the-job hours required for the apprenticeship and what's the hours required for the other thing, the top-up thing. There's some real risks there, and I think it's worth querying a model with the help centre if you do have some worries in that area. But I think the risk here is all the order to go to is going to be where it looks like there's a carrot in that program that's not the standard, and that's always going to be something that could be of high risk. The ILR, Martin's going to come to this bit a little later. We have new fields for hours types. and we're recording our planned hours and our pricing a slightly different way. Not in our TMP1, TMP2, that's still staying the same, essentially. But we've got a price reduction field, an RIP field as the kind of coolest named field we've had in the ILR for a very long time. Price still governed by the TMP fields, training price and assessment price. And there is an updated privacy notice that Martin's probably already put into the enrolment documentation within the platform. But do have a look at the ILR specification requirements. And some of the guidance in there is slowly being updated, and expect some changes as the year goes on. But again, you guys are fortunate. If you're Aptem customers, you're working with somebody that's working directly with those specification changes early. But yeah, make sure you are ensuring all of your applicants are seeing the privacy notice, the updated privacy notice, if they're due to start from the 1st of August 2026. Training plan. One of the strange things in apprenticeship units is 70% of the funding is triggered if the apprentice passes the skills test and the employer signs off that learner's training plan in apprenticeship units. And somebody's thought it's a very good idea to have training plans be signed off as complete, because it's coming potentially in the apprenticeship rules as well, that at the end of the program we need a section for the employer providing an apprentice to sign off that the content has been delivered. I'm not certain this one will stay in the funding rules permanently, but right now it was in the draft, and operationally it brings some challenges, I would say. I think it's fair to say. My advice to some of my clients has been, we have gateway reviews, and the employer and the provider involved in that. Most providers end up with the learner involved in that. That might be the place for a appropriate sign off that the training plan has been completed. But some auditors are going to want it on the specific training plan, so we're going to have to find a way of dealing with that potentially. Will it be a funding error, funding risk, the same as apprenticeship units? No, it shouldn't be, but you never know, it could be. So that's a bit of a strange one. It's nice to think that training plans are all signed off, but gateway review is really the point to agree that we're ready and we've delivered everything we need to. And if we haven't delivered everything, we've agreed why we did reduced hours. That's been the case for a little while. So yeah, that's a strange one, but it is in there. Progress reviews. Current requirement is 3 monthly, or more, if more appropriate, 4 times a year, if you have different milestones that make that fit better. Then in a kind of very strange softening position, the 26-27 draft rule suggests that, well, if we can't do them that frequently, they should be no more than 6 months apart. Please don't just have 6 monthly progress reviews. You will not do very well at Ofsted if that's the case. But yeah, it's your call, your decision. My advice is 3 monthly is kind of the minimum. 4 times a year can fit better if you've got better milestones. My advice for progress reviews is first progress review between weeks 4 to 6, because then you're managing the risk of the early disengagement, and then choose appropriate milestones that fit your curriculum thereafter, and put value into that review. Carefully consider what you've got in it and how it works. But anyway, think quality first before making decisions there. Don't just think, let's switch to 6 monthly review and that'll be great. I think there's real quality points at stake here if you don't do this very well. That's not to say you couldn't have really good review 6 months apart, but the risk here is in Ofsted, so seek appropriate advice in that space. Pricing. We did expect some changes in pricing. One of the things we will have is we will not need to break down the training price into eligible cost categories for new starts from August. Those are the 5 categories of initial assessment: off-the-job training, peripheral costs, management, administration, materials and consumables. We won't need to do that in 26-27. We can just agree a price for our TMP1 and TMP2. What we will also be able to do is, if we know what the TMP2 should be, we've got a price for what that is now, then we can enter that into the ILR. If it subsequently changes, currently we all know the fun and games from an admin perspective we have to do to update TMP2 if it's different to what we're being charged by the EPAO because they've increased the price for inflation or whatnot. The challenge we have here is a real administrative one. The department's trying to ease that burden. They're allowing the pricing to be readjusted by the provider without getting agreement of those changing composition bits. But it's only for starts from August at the moment. But again, final rules might allow that to be retrospective, but I don't believe it will be. Interestingly enough, if you've got an apprenticeship standard that is a reformed standard, one of the new ones with assessment integrated, you should still be locking in your TMP2 on day one because you've agreed a price with that EPAO from the start, theoretically. So this rule really wasn't really that necessary because it would have gone away in time with all reform standards. But anyway, there's positives. Going to mean less issues at audit around TMP2 being £2 or £3, £50 out with the price charged by the EPAO, but you're still going to have credible evidence to lock in that price originally, or you can't record that price until you know what it's going to be. Again, double check on what the rules are when they do finally come out here. It could include some retrospective elements, but at the moment it's for starts from the 1st of August. Therefore, every learner you've got coming through the system, you still need to get price agreement for changes for TMP1 and TMP2. Hopefully that makes sense. Yeah. Additional payments. So lots of positives here in terms of new employer incentives to recruit apprentices. For 25-26, we only had the extra £1,000 and two 500 payments for the 16 to 18-year-old, or if they were a 19 to 24-year-old care leaver or EHCP holder. This summer, we've got some, actually my next slide shows this better. We've got the original incentive at the top there, that's still here, still going to have that £1,000 for you and £1,000 for the employer, but into two £500 payments payable at day 90 and day 365, or shorter if it's a less than 12-month standard. We've got the foundation apprenticeship incentive that's been added, but then we've got this new £2,000 new SME hiring incentive that's in two equal instalments, again, day 90 and day 365. So, or day 242 if it's an apprenticeship under 12 months. So where I was saying that thing about employers wanting to know when they're going to get their money, this is the key thing you really need to stress is how that employer is going to get that money and when they're going to get that money. That's going to get paid through to you based on what you put in the ILR. So if the learner's been on the ILR for 90 days, we then do our funding claim at the end of that month. The government then knows that learner's been on 90 days. They'll then pay you that money in your next payment, and then you pass that on to the employer. So we're now getting on to probably 120, 130 days from that 90-day mark. Make sure you make it clear to employers when they're going to get their money. Otherwise, you could deliver a fantastic program, do a fantastic piece of work with them, and they're going to be really unhappy with you and not want to use you again because they'll want their money. There is a universal credit hiring incentive if that individual is aged 18 to 24. That's going to be paid directly by government. Again, details of that not fully clear because it doesn't need to be in the funding rules because it's not an apprenticeship funding thing. It's a universal credit thing, apparently. But I expect a few more bits of advice on there. All of this information, this table came from the apprenticeship service link that is in the middle of that article there in point 2. It's strange that the apprenticeship service had a little bit more information before the funding rules document did in that area. So I'm expecting a fair bit more in the funding rules to clarify how all these work. The other thing that still needs to be clear, and you saw it probably in that table, is the SME incentive from October. Is that for learners that start in October? Well, the funding rules suggest learners might be able to start earlier, but it's not clear cut yet. Particularly because of challenges and that individual's apprentice status. So we need to wait, unfortunately, for that one until the funding rules. The problem is that's the one you probably need to know now more than most because we're not that far away from the start of the year and employers are going to want to be knowing what incentives they can get. Most employers know they can get incentives. It's a difficult one to be out of position where we don't know when we're going to be able to pay you them or when your learner's allowed to start. If you had any more guidance from the department on that one, and you want to share, please do. But yeah, I'm thinking we'll see some more on that by the end of the month. But be very clear with your employers that it's a wait and see right now, rather than making promises to enroll at certain points when you haven't got clarity of what those are likely to be. But the £2,000 hiring incentive for ages 16 to 24, it could work really well if you're really looking to engage SMEs. SMEs, younger apprentices, that really is the market to target. But again, many employers struggling with the cost of living crisis right now. So yeah, be careful with that one. Non-levy payers linked to the employer incentive and the higher incentives are a little bit of a concern with reservation of funds. Currently, you can backdate starts by 1 month in the apprenticeship service when you're registering funds for a non-levy payer. The funding rules say that that's going to be by exception only in 26-27. So that could be problematic when you're looking to employers looking to recruit. I think it is linked to the incentives and knowing when the money's available. But again, see what the rules say in May when that comes out. But ensure your business development teams are aware that we're going to need to get learners in registered if they're non-levy funded sooner. Co-investment, you're probably all aware of the changing rules on co-investment for 26-27. The levy payer that exceeds their digital account will be charged at 25% rather than 5% for starts from the 1st of August. That will also apply to levy transfer overspend. So I think there's going to be a few more instances where levy transfer has been arranged, but the sending employer might not have enough money in their account in a given month to cover that. So the transfer recipient might still have some exposure there. The 10% top up to an employer's digital account has gone, again, meaning that employers have got slightly less money in their accounts to start with. And the timescales for using unused levy have decreased as well. So this is an area we do know about. Again, from a business development perspective, you need to be on this to make sure you're really sending the right messages to your employers, because nobody likes an unexpected invoice. Right now, when a levy payer overspends, there's a little bit of exposure. The money for each learner, it doesn't tend to be too much because it's only based on 5% of the excess. It's going to be based on 25% of the excess. Therefore, it's going to be slightly bigger sums and therefore be slightly more annoying to those employers. But the levy spend profile that used to be on the apprenticeship service system not currently working. So I know many clients that have been developing their own spending profiles to help providers in that space, employers in that space. Positive news, again, to increase the SME take up of apprenticeships. We won't have to pay co-investment for any new apprentice start aged under 25 at the non-levy payer. And that's really positive because currently that was only for aged under 22. So increased age group there. That with the employer incentives, could spark some business development opportunities. Again, subject to whatever's going on in your sector and the confidence of employers. But again, this is really all pre-entry stuff, getting your offer right, being clear with employers what they're entitled to. And your contracts for services will all need changing to take account all these changes in co-investment values and so on and so forth to make clear who's getting what, when and where and how. Then we get to the key one, subcontracting. I don't know if the department knew how much of an impact just changing a definition would have, but for many years now, we've had a bit of a conflict between IR35 and what's called disguised employment law, and an exception in the apprenticeship funding rules that allowed individuals under the provider control to be not deemed subcontractors. We've got a few changes in this space in the offing, again, subject to what the final version of the rules says later on this month. In 25-26, a provider, before let's not deal with the IR35 bit first, let's start off with the simple bit. In 25-26, a provider couldn't subcontract to any organisation that wasn't already on APAR unless that organisation was receiving less than £100,000. That's been reduced to a £25,000 de minimis, although that number might change later in when the final version comes out. But it will allow a provider to subcontract out without that organisation needing to be on a part to a specialist person delivering certain sessions, guest speakers, and so on and so forth, a little easier. Theoretically, they'd still need to have a UK PRN. They still need to be viewed as not being of higher risk. It's an area where I think the reality is there's significant change coming for a provider here. I did a webinar for SDN Mesmer where we went through these slides and asked how many people on the call were going to be exposed by the key change in this definition of subcontractor and directly managed. And it was 50% of the room. That's over sort of 200 providers out of 400. So in 25-26, freelance staff could be argued as not being subcontractors if they're using your materials, or under your control, operating in your name. But 26-27 introduces the IR35 definition, really, of directly managed and controlled. That definition you see on the right-hand side, which basically for a person to be deemed as under your control, I'm going to kind of cut to the chase here. They need to be able to access maternity, holiday, and sick pay, which most freelancers, actually all freelancers, can't. So it means that those individuals may be deemed as subcontractors, which means that you would have to manage them as subcontractors and administrate them as subcontractors. I think there will be some movement in the rules here in terms of expectations of what providers need to do, but it is an area of real challenge. There is an awful lot, if somebody is deemed a subcontractor, that you technically would have to do. If your total spend of individuals deemed subcontractors is over £100,000, then you'd need to meet the subcontracting standard, which will cost you some money to go through and get approved, and it's a 3-year cycle of getting that externally audited. Your freelancers will need a UK PRN. It doesn't take too long to get a UK PRN. It's about 5-minute activity, but you need an ICO registration. They need to, there's certain details need to be captured there. You'll need to undergo due diligence of your subcontractors. You'll need to publish the subcontracting policy that includes a rationale for using them. And if any individual freelancer or sole trader was paid more than 25 grand, you need to meet the subcontracting standard as well. You'll need to understand their income from other education sources. Again, these are all current things in the way the draft rules were set out. There may be concessions in some of these areas when the final rules come out, but there might not be. If you subcontract out more than 25% of your total funding, at the moment, you'd need to submit an exemption case to the department to say we want to spend more than 25% of our funding on subcontracting. The deadline for next year's requests has already passed, although there is an exceptional circumstances clause that I think everyone will be triggering. Your contracts of service with employers will need to detail the costs of the subcontract management and individual items of control. Training plans will need to specify the role of the parties in that delivery as well. You'll need to declare the freelancers and costs in your subcontractor declaration twice a year to the department. And then we have that clause of the main provider needing to deliver something of substance in the apprenticeship. So if you've got a freelancer delivering your apprenticeship program to the learner, what do you as the main provider actually do in that? Again, there may be concessions in the rules when this comes out, and it might all go away if those definitions are changed, those definitions on that previous page of directly managed and controlled. However, we are dealing now with the Department for Work and Pensions. We are dealing with a department that is much closer to HMRC and the Department for Education, potentially. So this is an area of significant administration for providers if the rules go in the way that draft rules said that they were. I think you have to start making plans, but await that May update. Yeah, there's some significant process and administration awaiting as a result if things go as they are. But I know providers have been asking for the things to change. Some lobbying going on. I'm not sure how successful it will be. This is the year that IR35 and disguised employment conditions finally seem to have caught up with the sector. Again, hopefully it'll be a little less bureaucratic, but it'll be an area where there's a lot of change needs to take place. Breaks in learning, if an individual was away for medical reasons in 25-26, it was unclear if the apprentice could continue in learning or require a break. Most providers were told they needed to apply a break. But 26-27, if the learner's away from work for medical reasons, they could continue under certain conditions. Again, let's see what the new rules look like in that space. A couple of subtle changes around the field of redundancy. If an individual following redundancy decides to become self-employed, they'll be allowed to carry on. Switching straight to self-employed rather than being made redundant is still a no-no. Yeah, quite a lot of stuff in there. So that was a real whistle stop of core changes. I'm doing a much deeper dive, a 3-hour session, walking through that learner journey with all those key changes. In the final version of the rules, I'll be doing that a little later next month. I've got a slide coming up where you can get a discount code for that series with SDM Mesmer. It's always a great series. That's not my words, those are the words of the feedback I've got before. But yeah, it's a year where administration and setup and infrastructure is where most of the changes are happening. So you're going to want to take time and make sure those things become clear in your systems. There's a real risk of misinformation across your organization, particularly around the role of co-investment and employer incentives. Do think about what that looks like. The incentives will create business, but misleading expectations will lead to failure long term. Think about what's coming and think about training your staff. Talk to your business development teams. Make sure they're not promising employers £2,000 in June, £2,000 in August, because they're not getting that money then. The money's going to get paid slowly based on learners staying in learning. So do think about what that looks like. Martin, Aptem's making some changes based on the things we know are definitely happening. What does that look like?
Indeed, and some changes on the things that we've had to have a look at in the funding rules as well. So yes, thank you, David. So looking at the ILR changes, one of the biggest changes coming up for us is the hours, the new hours entity, which will absorb the planned hours, actual hours, and recognised prior learning hours into a series of types based upon funding models. We've almost finished the work, in fact, to create that, migrate the data in, and make sure that all of the system will work with that, as well as maintaining the old structure of data for reporting purposes for the time being. We're also, as David mentioned, the coolest ILR code going. The reduction in price is being added. So with those fields all combined, using the RPL calculator process automation tracker that we have, you'll be able to enter the relevant information and automatically calculate these things based upon the funding rules and apply them to the ILR. Another change, I think very much related to the changes with the apprenticeship service, is the agreement ID coming in on the employment status. With all of this being in the ILR now, this essentially replaces the need for the apprenticeship service bulk upload. All of those fields are now going to be within the system, and you can export your ILR into the apprenticeship service. And of course, we are adding in the growth and skills short course program type and funding models and all the collection requirements ready for the new year. This is all being done through phased delivery. We expect this to be all completed in time for around sort of June, July, end of June, beginning of July, so that you have it in readiness for the new year. Move on to the next slide, please. With apprenticeship units, we are making some essential changes to the system to enable you to carry these out. So the first will be a new program type, delivery program type within the system that will capture all of the essential characteristics of an apprenticeship unit. So obviously it's removing all of the trappings of the apprenticeship that are no longer needed, as well as ensuring that hours, for example, are captured as delivery hours rather than off the job. We will also be creating a new apprenticeship unit training plan. So this will be a template, again, stripped back from the apprenticeship one, making sure all the language and terminology fits to the apprenticeship units. And it will have the two-part signing process built into it. And then throughout the rest of the system, we'll make sure that delivery hours are codified into the evidence submission and the upcoming activity log, alongside a declaration to support your eligibility for those hours with regards to it being tutor-led or in-person tutor, as well as it happening during work hours. We will then look at feedback from customers and look to make further improvements as apprenticeship units bed into the industry. And moving on next, please, David. And now, obviously, the funding rules could change, but these are our initial plans. So we will update the training plan. We will put in the second part of the signing, but we will have to see how that shapes up and see if that survives into the final rules. To support the ability to put in skill scans with regards to your training, your components that you're going to deliver as part of your training plan, we will surface the knowledge, skills and behaviours so that you have a supporting document to show that you have mapped those and are justified in using a skill scan against them. And with the firming up of the English and Maths actual end date, given that we have the facility to capture the last day of learning or the last activity for English and Maths within the system, we will make sure this is surfaced within the withdrawal tracker functionality to make sure that you get those dates correct. And that's everything. Whistle stop tour on that one. So Q&A now. I have flagged a few questions and we'll answer some others as we go. I wanted to ask straight away. Just to double down on the subcontracting things, David, I've got a question here from Joanna, sorry. Would getting guest speakers in for lectures or workshops count as a subcontractor, especially with Ofsted pushing for more pastoral efforts with students?
So the idea of the 25,000 de minimis originally is to allow for more ease of having somebody come in that's not on the APAR, deliver something of real use within a program. What these rules are saying is that, okay, they'll need a UK PRN, but they will need to be recorded as a subcontractor, but it's for a very limited exercise. I can, with a lot of my clients, we've already talked about how in our contract for services with an employer, we might have a more generic section for the use of guest speakers, for example, and that generically we will pay the odd guest speaker, but it will be less than this, and this is how much it costs us to manage it, and template that content. But it should allow for guest speakers to be used without fear. Right now, you can currently do that, but they would still be deemed subcontractors. But at the moment, many providers are kind of using sole traders, self-employed, freelance as under their control, where you're not having to declare them a subcontractor. If any of those were a limited company or were set up as a limited company, then technically they would be subcontractors now. It's an imperfect set of rules because it's the meeting of what is really HMRC expectations against something we've been used to doing for quite some time without too much fear in our sector. But these two things do seem to have caught up with each other. So I expect there to be some more. I would hope there'd be some concessions in the evidence requirements to make it easier for what I'm calling the quasi-controlled individual, if that makes sense, where we wouldn't need to do all these other extra things, but it's still deemed down as a subcontractor. But it would require hopefully less stuff, but we'll see.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, a question that might require some speculation. There was talk that there would be a new rule in the 26-27 rules around visa length not having to cover the full length of an apprenticeship. Is this the case, or have they?
So when in conference season at the start of the year, the department said they did want to bring in a flexibility that if the provider had significant confidence or words to that effect that individual's visa would be extended, that they would be deemed eligible. Currently, they're not deemed eligible if that individual, their residence permission or their contract of employment exceeded it was less than expected end of EPA. They wanted to bring something in around residency status, and it was stated as we're waiting, the department was waiting Treasury approval. Clearly didn't happen in time for the draft rules. Who's to say it might still have been asked for and it might appear in the final rules, but currently it's not in the draft rules. So we were just talking earlier, weren't we, Martin, about there's always the prospect for the additional new thing to be added in the rules, when Treasury has made a decision and says we can afford to do this now. Another thing was the potential waiving of the rule where if you haven't collected co-investment on your completions, that you currently don't get your completion monies. But there was hope that that was going to get waived too, but that wasn't in the draft rules either. Again, whether it comes into the final rules, maybe Treasury approval has come, or maybe it's just been dropped. We'll know more when that May version comes out.
Excellent. I might be somewhat self-serving here. I've got a question about timelines around some of the work that we're releasing. There is a lot going on, and there's a lot of crunch between these different sort of things. So as we're expecting ILR around sort of the June, July release for us, the next thing in the pipeline is apprenticeship units. I'm hoping that'll come out at the same sort of time, but again, it might slip into July. And then the next thing would be our funding rules, which again, we're hoping for, well, we've put in contingency to aim for July, depending upon what the scale of change is coming in. I should have mentioned that. Let me pick out another one for you.
Well, there's a good question here actually about, somebody said about, where we, as a EPAO, does our external independent assessor count as a subcontractor? If I take that one, so the subcontracting element, the concern in terms of having to report it and deal with the administrative requirements around individuals that are any element of the education and training that is funded, there it's down as we do not consider to be a subcontractor a company or individual solely providing a non-training delivery service such as marketing or an assessment organization. So EPAOs are not deemed subcontractors that need to be declared, although they are separate legal entities. But it's the delivery of learning within a program where the key concern is. But it's, again, pay close attention to what these changes are in the final version would be my advice. With on-program endpoint assessment, or whatever it's being called, I think those things will still continue to be refined and changed. Again, if it's not delivering the learning, it should be okay. But it's equally, if you're an organisation delivering learning support adjustments in how to learn, that's not going to count. But if that organisation was delivering KSB delivery, then it would count, if that makes sense. So it's a really grey area. I mean, these are all still separate legal entities. It's just, do they need to be declared as subcontractors in your subcontracting declaration?
Yes. Excellent. There's one here quoting a paragraph from the rules, which I
love that. Yes.
So we've got, in reference to paragraph 197, so the price of an apprenticeship policy change to aid simplification, the contract for services with the employer can now be at a program level. I'll just jump straight to the question. Does this mean that the contract for services does not need to list the name of the apprentices?
Yeah, it certainly looks that way. The whole idea is because you've got an apprenticeship service entry for that learner with their price, then, and a training plan with that learner, you've got an agreement with that employer for that learner. So I think the whole idea is the contract for services is more on, you can have a framework for delivery with an employer. You could have a schedule for a volume of apprentices, but not detail those individual apprentices. But when those individual apprentices are enrolled, there is a signed training plan, there is an apprenticeship service entry for that learner, and the employer confirms that. So I think that's kind of where they're going with the simplification there, if that makes sense.
Excellent. I reckon we can squeeze one more question in.
And then we can promote stuff. Yes.
Yes, indeed. So so they've got this person here has some potential learners doing functional skills via charity who may be starting in September. Would they be able to complete those functional skills separately whilst starting the apprenticeship? They wouldn't be exempt at the start of the program, in brackets.
Yeah, so they're doing a program of functional skills before the apprenticeship. It's a really good question. That's probably one for the help desk, because you could technically read it and say no, but actually the rules are saying it's possible to do functional skills alongside the apprenticeship could be okay. Yeah, that one might need to be queried. I'll revisit that one. I mean, let's be honest, qualitative having the functional skills achieved before start is probably the best way of doing it, because then you know the learners at the level that you're going to be able to teach at. But lots of different ways of delivering certain models. Yeah. Okay. So I did mention this earlier, Martin, and please forgive me for a moment for self-promotion. Like I said, I do have a deep dive series with ESDM Mesmer Group on the change to the funding rules. 17th of June and the 24th of July are 2 parts where we dig much deeper into the detail. I will supply a very detailed action plan, including implications, recommendations, and it's not as tough a session as you might think. It's actually quite enjoyable, but yeah, we give a lot of tools out with that as well, with that action plan. It's a really good series. App10 customers are getting a really nice, healthy 30% discount code. Use that promo code app10 FR26, and you can book using that little QR squiggle on the bottom right. Squiggle is a technical phrase I've chosen to use today. QR code.
Yeah,
but it's still a squiggle. It's a great series. Some feedback, comments on the right-hand side. I always put in a tremendous amount of work into it, because what we do at the start of the year sets us up for the full year. So it's well worth having a little look. We can all read the funding rules. We can all use chat, Copilot, and come up with some core things. But there's sometimes no better solution actually being able to live soundboard those queries and see some of these things in action. I'll show some examples of how some of that terminology can work, what some of those clauses could look like. And it's a really good session. We don't just go, oh, these are the rules, change them. It's really about implementation. So that's really exciting. Hopefully you can join us on that. Yeah, again, there's that QR code there. But App10 have got some cool stuff coming up as well, haven't they, Martin?
Indeed. Thank you, David. Yes, so before we wrap up, I certainly encourage you to visit our website and explore our upcoming events. There'll be a link shared in the chat. We host a wide range of events, including our flagship customer conference, Aspire. I'll be there, and David will be too, as well as thought leadership sessions and industry conferences and award celebrations. That brings us to the end. Thank you for joining us. I hope you have a great day, and yeah, we'll see you next time.
Thank you.